And I want to start again by welcoming everybody to the Civics Project. Our topic today is the Constitution. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So as noted, our topic today is the U.S. Constitution. And I want to start by thinking a little bit about what a constitution is. Everybody knows certain sorts of catchphrases like, that's unconstitutional. And usually folks will have some sort of concept of what the Constitution is. We know that it's a foundational document in our legal system. And some folks will place it with a year. They'll talk about 1776 or the founding of the nation. So I want to add to that just a baseline definition that a constitution is often thought of as the sort of skeleton framework for a legal system. So it is the most basic legal rules that establish a government and that establish rules that can't be overridden by any other laws unless there is an actual change to the Constitution itself, or a constitutional amendment, so to speak. So when someone says that's unconstitutional, what they're saying is that that a law or practice violates some preface of the Constitution as it's been written. And to make good sense of that, or to make more sense of what it means to violate a constitution, I want to talk about how the U.S. Constitution functions in legal systems. And for those of you with a background in law or government or policy, bear with the rest of us. I want to make sure that the subject matter is more accessible for everybody. So a basic thing to understand is that in the United States, the U.S. Constitution is a federal legal document. And one of the things that means is that nothing that it says can be overwritten either by the U.S. legislature or by any state legislature. So the only way to contradict something in the Constitution legally is to actually go through the fairly complicated and difficult process of amending it, which in the United States has been done a number of times, which is how we have our Bill of Rights comprised of constitutional amendments. And my cat is wanting to join the Zoom, so for our live audience, you may see her pop on screen in a moment. In addition, the Constitution is not very long. Some of you who are fans of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg may know that she carried around a pocket Constitution, and she could do that because the text of it is small enough to fit in your pocket. It's not a full-fledged book. It's something that you could read in around an hour, maybe 90 minutes or so if you take your time or if you're a slower reader. But it's a fairly brief text, not always straightforward, but brief. That doesn't mean that everything in it is always clear or easy to interpret, and that's one of the reasons that we have our federal court systems, which are tasked with the job of interpreting the Constitution. So all of this is pretty basic, and my remarks today are now going to focus in on some of the key ways to understand the history and contemporary context of the U.S. Constitution. Some of you may have been hearing the word originalism more often lately in U.S. law and politics, in U.S. government, and in conversations about the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. An originalist is someone who adheres to the general principle that we should interpret the meanings of the Constitution based on whatever we know about the founders of the Constitution's intent in writing it. So in other words, essentially we should use 1776 standards in order to interpret the meaning of the Constitution. In the area of constitutional legal doctrine, for instance, if you were to get constitutional legal scholars together to talk about the subject, one of the things that you might hear is the concept of the living Constitution. And this is offered up as an alternative way to relate to the Constitution as compared to originalism. So the living Constitution essentially says that we should interpret the Constitution based on the popular will of the people at the time that it is being interpreted. So for instance, if we were in the 1970s, we would interpret the Constitution based on what matters to people in the 1970s and, relatively speaking, what popular morals and norms are at the time, rather than going back to 1776 standards. And today, this would mean that we would, under the principle of the living Constitution, interpret the Constitution relative to those who are living now. So we would use 2021 standards in order to interpret the Constitution. And there's still a lot of questions and disagreement about what are our standards, our norms, our popular will today. That alone is a hotly contested issue. So one of the things that we see is that a controversy that's continuing to rage about our contemporary Supreme Court is that a number of our current Supreme Court justices are constitutional originalists. That is, when there is a question about how to interpret the Constitution. These are folks who are saying we should adhere to 1776 standards and use those in order to make sense of the Constitution today. So I can imagine that our live and our podcast audience might have a number of questions about that. But in order to unpack what it means to use 1770 standards, I'm going to dive into the history of the founding of the Constitution again and talk a little bit about what were its origins, what were the precepts and premises and presumptions of the founding fathers. Last week, for those of you who joined us for our launch session, I talked a little bit about the 1840s U.S. Census and efforts to expose the way that it had fraudulently counted people in the United States. And one of the people I mentioned in the course of that discussion was the 6th president to the United States, John Quincy Adams. So I want to jump back roughly, 64 years to 1776 and talk a little bit about an exchange between his father, John Adams, who was the first vice president of the United States under George Washington and was the second president of the United States. So John Adams had an exchange with his wife, Abigail Adams, who was, along with Susan B. Anthony, is often known as one of the Revolutionary era, more prominent white feminists at the time. So Abigail Adams and John Adams, her husband, had this exchange in 1776, and I'm just going to read some brief excerpts from their letters. These letters have come to be known as the Remember the Ladies letters, and the effort that Abigail Adams was making in these letters was to try to insert the subject of emancipation or liberty for women into contemplation of the Constitution. And we also get to hear a little bit of John Adams's responses. In the process, his responses are particularly revealing and saying more about the ways in which the Constitution was meant to conceive of race and of the sort of the hierarchy that the Constitution was meant to uphold and reinforce. So Abigail, on March 31st of 1776, wrote to John, "I've sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who have been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs. Of this, I am certain that it is not founded upon that generous and Christian principle of doing to others as we would that others should do unto us. I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly, give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why not then put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and an imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. So for those who are thinking about how to interpret this, one thing that we can note about Abigail Adams's language is that she very much is deploying the sorts of frames that were present among men in the revolutionary period. She's talking about tyrants, which is a word that is accorded to the British imperial state, and particularly King George. She's, of course, talking about rebellion, and she's talking about the principle that you should not be bound by law in which you have no representation. And so she's basically trying to say, just as you are rebelling against these European powers which continue to hold North American territories as British colonies, so we rebel against any tyranny which represses us. So this was Abigail Adams, or at least an excerpt from her letter to her husband on March 31st of 1776, as the Constitutional Congress was preparing to convene and starting to do its work. And he wrote back to her just about exactly two weeks later on April 14th. So this is from John Adams to Abigail Adams. He said, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We do not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters. And rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. I am sure every good politician would plot, as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or ochlocracy. A fine story indeed. I begin to think the ministry as deep as they are wicked. After stirring up Tories, land jobbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, Russians, Irish Roman Catholics, and Scotch renegades, at last they have stimulated thee to demand new privileges and threaten to rebel." So there's a lot to think about here in making sense of the exchange between John Adams and Abigail Adams. We want to understand that John Adams was one of the most privileged people in the revolutionary government. And in some respects, so was Abigail Adams, as a woman certainly of the very upper class of the elite, though as she highlights, her sex, her gender, obviously compromised some aspects of those privileges. His response to her, though, is deeply revealing. in terms of making sense of what premises guided the founding fathers. And though, of course, he was only one person and not necessarily speaking for everybody in on the drafting of the Constitution, the fact that he was elected vice president under George Washington certainly speaks to the degree of influence he held and the extent to which his ideas were likely to have been very mainstream at the time. And of course, we can look at other sorts of documents and reflections from that period to get a sense of the ways in which his presumptions and ideas were in sync with his fellows, with the other the other white men who were in on the process of drafting the foundational legal documents of the United States. So I have just a few comments to make about John and Abigail. One of the things that we want to understand was what was at stake in the Revolutionary War. And the Adams letters reveal that people had different stakes, that for many in the United States, in what would become rather the United States, in North American colonies at the time, the prospect of rebelling against the British Empire was perceived as a potential opportunity to overthrow the profoundly complex hierarchies that had been established by the colonization process. So these different groups that John Adams named, he named students, he named children and young people, he named workers when he named apprentices, he named Black people who were enslaved, he named indigenous peoples when he talked about guardians and Indians. So and he also talked about different political sectors and segments in his letters. And what he was highlighting at the time is that there was hope that in throwing off British Empire, perhaps something closer to some sort of equality could be achieved. And it's important to understand that the colonist men who were rebelling, specifically the white, relatively wealthy landowning men who were at the top of that rebellion, not necessarily all the bodies who were fighting for it, but the people who were running that effort, who were in the position of holding the most power, were certainly going against generations of training to defer to a monarchy, to see the rights accorded to kings as both divine under God and as morally right and as legally supreme. And so they looked to language of freedom and equality and liberty in order to find a new set of justifications to say, no, this is why it is good for us to challenge a king, which we have all been taught, which our predecessors and ancestors have all been taught is a wrong or bad thing to do. And so they turned to this language of freedom and equality, and what John Adams is bemoaning is the fact that as they started to talk about freedom, about liberty as God-given rights, everybody heard them. And many people who were suffering under tremendous layers of inequity started to say, yes, let's actually pursue that. So what John Adams's response to Abigail reveals is that the revolutionary effort was intended to strip off the top layer of a complex hierarchy, which placed king over wealthy European landowning men, all men over wives and children, all Europeans over indigenous peoples, and slave owners over enslaved people. And the intent that at least Adams indicated in founding the Constitution was only to remove that first layer, to say we, the men who are otherwise nearly at the very top of this hierarchy, are going to strip away the top layer. You can kind of think about it as like the top 5% rebelling against the top 1%, right? So we're going to take away the top layer comprised of the British Empire, but keep all of the structures that that empire put in place otherwise and just replace the king, basically take over. And they wanted to do so without creating a new king. They contemplated the idea of simply having George Washington become king. And he was insistent on some sort of democracy and establishing a presidency. And so the Constitutional Congress was tasked with figuring out how that would be done and what it would look like. And they drafted this, again, relatively brief document, which established a set of rules. But it's important to understand that the original intentions of the Constitutional Congress were not to guarantee universal liberty or equality, but rather to remove that top layer and to maximize the chances of liberty and equality for those who hold it. So jumping back just to a moment to the beginning of Abigail's comments to John, she says, again, I've sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breasts of those who've been accustomed to deprive their fellow creatures of theirs. I read her as calling out the contradiction between his decision to participate in subordinating so many people in the society, and her focus, of course, is on women like herself, to his willingness to participate in subordination while simultaneously expressing a passion for liberty. And again, we got to hear a little bit of his response. So I want to invite our Zoom attendees to share their questions or comments in the chat. And while we do that, for those who joined us last week, you may recall that we also have a little weekly feature as part of the civics project called CivTriv or Civics Trivia. I know it's a little corny. And I'm going to share screen with those of us who are live now. And we'll also read everything for those who are joining us on our audio recording. So we're going to go through those and we'll take some questions, and I'll also share a few follow-up notes from last week. And then we will be done with our live recording and go to audience Q&A. So our first question is this: has a Supreme Court justice ever been impeached and convicted by the US Congress? The first answer choice is A, yes, someone has been, at least one person has been impeached and convicted. Impeached by the House, convicted by the Senate. Answer choice B is impeached by the House but not convicted by the Senate. So no one has ever been convicted, but someone has been impeached. Answer choice C, jumping back on our slide. Answer choice C, neither of those has happened. A Supreme Court justice has never been impeached or convicted. And D, as indicated in the Constitution, Supreme Court justices cannot be impeached since they are appointed for life. So feel free, if you're in our live audience, to to select an answer choice in the chat. And the correct answer on this one is B, Samuel Chase in 1805. A Supreme Court justice associated with the Federalist Party was impeached by the House, basically for failing to act in an impartial manner. He was a Federalist Party member, and the accusation was that he was being extremely biased on the bench. So the House impeached him. It looked like he might be convicted. His party, the Federalists, had a minority of seats in the Senate, but he did manage to swing some of the other senators and eventually was not convicted. One of the likely outcomes, at least associated to judicial scholars who pay attention to the early 19th century, is that this sent the message to the Supreme Court and to the federal courts at large that they could act in ways that were fairly partisan without facing a serious threat of conviction in Congress. And Samuel Chase was the only Supreme Court justice to, again, ever be impeached by the US Congress and was not convicted. About 15 federal court judges in the lower courts throughout all of US history have ever been impeached, and a smaller handful have been convicted. Some of them resigned when they were impeached. Some of them were acquitted in a hearing in the Senate, and as noted, a few were convicted and removed, but it's been quite rare out of over time many thousands of federal judges. Second trivia question: when is a constitutional amendment ratified? Or you could understand that question as, how is the constitutional amendment ratified? Answer choice A, when 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the members of the Senate both vote in favor of the amendment. Answer choice B, when 2/3 of the state legislatures vote in favor of the amendment. C, either A or B, so either Congress can do it or the state legislatures can do it. And D, neither A or B. And the question again is, when is the Constitution, or how is a constitutional amendment ratified? How is it finalized? So again, for our Zoom audience, you can put your answers in the chat. I'll give folks just a few seconds to think about that one. And the answer choice on this one is D. So neither a 2/3 vote of Congress or a 2/3 vote of the state legislature is sufficient to actually finish amending the Constitution. But you can start the process in either of those two ways. So what's actually happened in US history is that 2/3 of Congress will agree that an amendment should go forth, but the process of ratification means it has to go then out to all of the state legislatures, and at least 3/4 of all of the states must then ratify the amendment for it to go through. So for instance, there have been hundreds, more than 500 attempts to abolish the Electoral College by a constitutional amendment. And they have always failed every time, because it was never possible to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to agree to do it. So no constitutional amendment is ever ratified without support from 3/4 of the US states. 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of legislature. In practice, it's been 2/3 of Congress, but in theory, the legislatures could also start the process. So 2/3 can put it up for ratification, but only 3/4 of the states can actually ratify. Last question. Under the US Constitution, what is the term full faith and credit refer to? A, the obligation of federal courts to treat individuals as credible until given a reason to doubt that credibility. B, the obligation of the executive branch to consult in good faith with the Senate when proposing Supreme Court justices. C, the obligation of states to recognize the laws and proceedings of other states. And D, the obligation of the legislature to observe rights granted to the states by the Constitution. So again, the question is, what is full faith and credit? And the answer on this one is C, the obligation of states to recognize the laws and proceedings of other states. So for instance, if you get divorced in California, then the state of Florida would not insist that you were still married. They would recognize California's courts as capable of granting your divorce. Now, as you can imagine, states recognizing the laws of other states can get really sticky when two states have laws that conflict with another. So I mentioned divorce. Same-sex marriage would be a good example of an instance where how to interpret or apply full faith and credit, at least before it became legal under our federal court system, right, was an example of an area where full faith and credit was debated. But the basic idea is that where you have comparable sets of laws that exist in different US states, the states will recognize one another and recognize their laws as valid. Now for our Zoom audience, I'm putting up a few opportunities for more learning. If you'd like to learn more about the impeachment of Justice Samuel Chase, the process of amending the Constitution, and the interpretation of the part of the Constitution which covers full faith and credit, and that's Article 4, Section 1. And I'll also, for our Zoom audience, put those links in our chat. A few more things to cover today, and also want to take any audience questions. I said last week and then completely forgot to share it that we will be sharing a book recommendation for each week. So for this week, my book recommendation is The Narrative of Sojourner Truth by Sojourner Truth and dictated to her neighbor, Olive Gilbert, and published in 1850. Sojourner Truth was born basically one generation after remember, the ladies' letters between Abigail and John Adams. So she was born in 1797. It had been 21 years. And she was among the sort of deeply, I would say, in a positive sense, radical thinkers and organizers in terms of challenging the hierarchy that continued to be maintained as the United States, continued to articulate itself as a new nation. And so she's a great person to kind of get a sense of politics in that period, post-Revolutionary War. For last week, I'll share the recommendation now. And it was supposed to be For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer, which was authored by Dr. Chana Kai Lee. And I also just wanted to add one clarification or correction to last week's session. I mentioned last week that the 1840s conflict over both the US Census and the admission of Texas to the Union, and noted the distinction between northern states that were not slave owning and southern that were. And I should clarify that some sectors within northern states at the time did still tolerate US slavery, and in fact did until the end of the Civil War, when they had to be rooted out. So it's an overgeneralization to say that the northern states were not at all slave owning. So that concludes my prepared remarks, and I think we have a couple questions from our audiences. Some folks are asking about Supreme Court justices having jobs for life. It's not only Supreme Court justices. Right now, it's most federal judges get appointments for life, but there's nothing at all in the Constitution about it. It's a rule that was created by the legislature, which means it is much, much easier to change as compared to actually amending the Constitution. Remember, to amend the Constitution, it's a lot of process and time, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to ratify it. But as long as something is not covered in the Constitution, then it can be changed by the legislative and executive branches. So Congress established the rule that federal judges serve for life. And if you were watching, for instance, the vice president's debate between Michael Pence and Kamala Harris last fall, then you might have noticed that one of the questions that he asked her was whether the Democratic Party, if they won, would attempt to pack the Supreme Court. What he was referring to was that the possibility that a Democrat-run Congress combined with a Democratic executive branch could expand the number of Supreme Court justices. And as those of you who were with us last week or last episode learned, the Constitution does not specify how many justices there should be. It's been 9 for a long, long time, but it doesn't have to be. That could be changed by Congress. So they don't have to serve for life. Congress could change that. And they don't have to be confined to 9. So just to say something about the composition of the Supreme Court now, we have 6 Supreme Court justices who are considered very right-wing. Most of them either do or would likely, based on their history of rulings, identify as constitutional originalists. So one of the questions that progressives and liberals are debating is, should the composition of the Supreme Court be changed in order to upset that supermajority that right now the political right holds? And it's certainly going to be a very pressing question because we have a Democratic-controlled Congress, a Democratic-controlled executive branch, a mix of Democratic and Republican judges in the lower federal courts, the courts of appeals and the district courts. But then we have this very right-wing Supreme Court. So I would expect to see that question continue to play out. And I'm just looking to see if there are any other pressing questions. Someone is asking, what does it mean to be appointed for life? Well, what it means for a Supreme Court justice is that the only ways that you can be removed from the bench are if you die, of course, if you voluntarily retire, or if you are impeached. And we know that a Supreme Court justice has never been successfully convicted and removed from the bench, though one in 1805 was impeached, but not removed. Let's see, Victoria is asking, I appreciate the distinction between originalists and living constitutionalists. How is it possible to not consider the formation of the Constitution is as a reflection of a singular moment in time, not unlike the 1970s or now? Well, one thing we can say is that I don't know that all constitutional originalists would say it's only a reflection of it's not a reflection of a singular moment in time. I think they might I think in some instances they might say, we don't care. We are still going to adhere to the recommendations and presumptions of our forefathers. In other words, if this was the foundational document which created the United States, then we should not attempt to reinterpret it based on, sort of the whims or norms of a present time. And so I think that's how an originalist, and obviously I'm not one, but I think that's how an originalist might respond to that question. Let's see. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So I'm going to end our recording for today and have more of a conversation with our live audience. For those who are listening in later, you can find a list of upcoming sessions for the Civics Project next week. On February 7th of 2021, we'll be meeting to talk about the executive branch, and our live audience will learn how to research an executive order. How do you find one and how do you make sense of it? After that, we'll be talking about the federal courts, and we will also, on the third week of February, get into the process of impeachment since it's so timely. In addition, we're going to be adding a once-a-month event to the Civics Project. We'll be meeting every last Wednesday of the month, whether it's 4th or 5th, every last Wednesday, to basically have a virtual watch party of a film bearing on government and politics. So we'll be meeting in this case on, let's see, just checking our date. I believe it's going to be March, last Wednesday. I believe we've actually got it set for the last Wednesday of February. So the Civics Project will be screening the film Suppressed 2020, The Fight to Vote, on February 24th of 2021 at 4 o'clock Pacific time. So if you'd like to join us, we'll be doing a watch party of the film in Zoom. It's available on YouTube, so you can also watch it in that way in your own, and then having group discussions afterwards about the film. For those of you who happen to be Stacey Abrams fans, there's some great interview footage with her in the film, and the film as a whole takes about an hour, just a little less. Okay, so thanks again for those who are joining us belatedly, and we'll be back soon.